Listen closely because what I am about to reveal goes against everything you've been taught about love and attraction. You've probably spent months or even years chasing, texting first, trying to prove your worth, and it's backfired every single time, right? What if I told you that the entire dynamic you're stuck in is actually a mirror of what you believe about yourself? In the next few minutes, I'm going to show you an ancient psychological technique rooted in the principles Carl Jung discovered about the unconscious mind that completely reverses the pattern, turning you into the one who is irresistible while they experience an emotional distance they can't explain and can't escape from. This isn't about manipulation or games. This is about understanding the hidden architecture of attraction through emotional psychology and the psychology of love, so you can finally step into your actual power. By the end of this training, you'll understand why he pulls away, what it really means, and more importantly, you'll know exactly how to trigger the emotional attachment that makes him incapable of leaving. You'll learn the secret signs he loves you even when he's fighting his feelings, and you'll discover how to access the inner power that millionaires and high-value individuals naturally possess in relationships. If you're tired of being the one who always reaches out first, if you're exhausted from wondering about his secretly loves you, or if you're just trying to decode what his silence actually means, this video is designed specifically for you. Stay with me because everything changes in the next few minutes. The moment you understand that every single interaction in your romantic life is a direct reflection of your internal belief system, everything shifts. Carl Jung explains in his groundbreaking work on the psyche that we don't attract people based on what we say, or do we attract them based on what we fundamentally believe we deserve. This is where most people get it completely wrong. They focus on external behaviors, texting strategies, game-playing tactics, perfecting their appearance, or memorizing conversation techniques. But here's what the psychology of love actually reveals. Your internal world is broadcasting 24/7, and he's receiving that transmission whether he's conscious of it or not. When you believe deep down that you're not the prize, that you have to chase to be chosen, that you're less valuable than he is, those beliefs radiate from your energy field like a beacon, and he responds to that frequency without even knowing why. This isn't mystical nonsense, this is emotional psychology at its finest, grounded in decades of research about how our unconscious beliefs shape our reality. Think about the last time he pulled away. Remember that feeling of confusion? You probably replayed every conversation, analyzed every text, wondered if you said something wrong. But here's what was actually happening beneath the surface. His emotional distance wasn't about your words or your actions. It was about his internal state, his own repressed emotions, his unconscious patterns that Jung spent his entire career mapping out. When he pulls away, what it really means is that he's disconnected from his emotional attachment to you because, subconsciously, he senses that you don't believe you're worthy of his consistent pursuit. The psychology of love teaches us that we become what we believe about ourselves, and everyone around us, especially the person we're most vulnerable with, mirrors that belief back to us instantly. If you're operating from a space of emotional control where you're managing your reactions, analyzing his behavior, and trying to decode his silence, you're actually broadcasting neediness disguised as intelligence. You're showing him, through your behavioral patterns, that his approval matters more to you than your own peace. This is the opposite of the inner power that attracts a millionaire mindset in relationships. Now, let's talk about what happens on the other side of this equation. When you shift your internal beliefs, when you stop operating from emotional need and start operating from emotional abundance, his perception of you fundamentally transforms. This is where the real transformation begins, and this is where most people miss the opportunity entirely. The unconscious mind, both yours and his, begins to reorganize around this new reality. He starts experiencing what psychologists call emotional distance in reverse. Instead of him pulling away because he senses your desperation, he now feels an emotional pull toward you that he can't explain and can't resist. Hidden feelings that he's been suppressing, feelings he might not even consciously understand, start surfacing with intensity. He begins to experience what looks like him fighting his feelings, but what's actually happening is his unconscious mind is recognizing that you've become someone different. The signs he loves you multiply because love, in its truest form, is based on recognition of worth and value. When you finally embody the belief that you are the prize, that your presence is the reward, everything changes about how he experiences you. The detachment work is crucial here, and I need you to understand this deeply because this is where the real power lives. Detachment doesn't mean you stop caring, it means you stop needing him to care in order to validate yourself. This is the millionaire mindset applied to relationships. A person with wealth doesn't panic when money comes or goes because they understand their value is undependent on any single source. They have inner power that exists independent of external circumstances. You need to become that person in your romantic life. When you operate from this space of detachment, something fascinating happens in the psychology of love. You become irresistible. Why? Because you're no longer broadcasting desperation. You're no longer seeking validation through his attention. You're no longer trying to decode his silence like it's a message about your worth. Instead, you're standing in your own power, and that power is magnetic. He can feel it. He can sense it even when you're not physically present. This is where emotional attachment transforms from something he's resisting into something he's craving. Carl Jung explains that the shadow side of ourselves, the parts we reject, deny, or repress, actually holds tremendous power once we integrate it. In relationships, this shadow contains all the strength, boundary setting, self-protection, and self-love that you've been taught to suppress in favor of being easygoing or understanding or forgiving. When you reclaim this shadow material, when you stop fighting your own need to be valued and instead demand it as your baseline standard, you access an emotional control that isn't about controlling him, it's about controlling your own energy and presence. This is when the emotional psychology shifts entirely. He is no longer the one with power in the dynamic, because power was never really his to have. Power exists within you, in your beliefs, in your willingness to walk away, in your absolute certainty of your own worth. And watch for this sign. The moment you genuinely embody this, he'll start fighting his feelings about losing you in ways he never fought his feelings about having you. The difference is stark, measurable, and undeniable. Here's where it gets really interesting, and this is the section that changes everything, because we're moving from theory into the actual mechanics of how emotional attachment works in the human psyche. The psychology of love is uncomplicated once you understand that it's entirely rooted in perception and projection. He doesn't actually know you. What he knows is his fantasy of you, his projection onto you, his unconscious association of you with his own emotional needs and desires. This is, Jung explains, one of his most important concepts: projection. We project our inner world onto others and fall in love with that projection rather than the actual person. So when he pulls away, he's usually reacting to his own internal world, not to anything you've actually done wrong. What it really means when he seems distant is that his unconscious mind is sensing that you're available on his terms, that you'll accommodate his emotional distance, that you're willing to wait for his crumbs of attention. This perception is the entire foundation of the dynamic that keeps you chasing while he pulls away, seemingly comfortable in that arrangement. The turning point comes when you understand that falling in love isn't rationally, it's deeply psychological, rooted in the unconscious mind's recognition of someone who represents completion or challenge or growth. When you've been the one always reaching out, always trying to understand him, always making his emotions your responsibility, you've actually positioned yourself as the therapist in the relationship rather than the romantic partner. UVA created a dynamic where he gets all the emotional control because UVA handed it to him on a silver platter. Now, reversing this requires something that feels counterintuitive at first. You must embrace silence, not as punishment, but as power. Silence is one of the most underrated tools in emotional psychology, because silence is where the unconscious mind does its work. When you stop explaining yourself, stop defending yourself, stop reaching out to confirm he still cares, you're creating space for his own unconscious fears to surface. He'll start imagining what you're doing, who you might be with, whether you've moved on. His hidden feelings, the ones he's been repressing, the ones he's been keeping locked away, suddenly become unbearable in that silence. He begins to experience emotional attachment not as something he's tolerating, but as something he desperately needs. This is the millionaire mindset approach to relationships. You become scarce. You become the limited resource that suddenly seems more valuable. This isn't a game, it's psychology. When something is readily available, our brains assign it less value. When something is rare, our brains signal us that we need to act quickly or lose it forever. By stepping back, by allowing emotional distance to exist without you chasing through it, you're triggering his survival instinct around losing something he's taken for granted. The psychology of love tells us that men often need to feel like they are re-pursuing in order to feel attraction. When you've been the pursuer, you've actually suppressed his natural masculine drive to chase, to prove himself, to win your affection. By creating space, by letting go of the outcome, you're suddenly inviting him to step into his natural role. And that role comes with all the emotional intensity and commitment that comes from him choosing to pursue rather than being pursued. Now let's get specific about what happens in his unconscious mind during this transition. Carl Jung explains the concept of the shadow war, the repressed emotions, the denied feelings, the parts of himself he's been rejecting in relationships. These shadow aspects are often where his deepest fears live. He might be fighting his feelings about you because his shadow contains terror about vulnerability, about being rejected, about losing control. When you were chasing, you were essentially saying, "I'll manage this, you don't have to feel anything." And that actually enabled his emotional avoidance. But when you change the dynamic, when you stop managing his emotions and stop proving your worth, something in him wakes up. He can no longer hide in your pursuit. He can no longer deny what he is feeling because his repressed emotions are no longer being soothed by your attention. What it really means when he suddenly starts reaching out, when his silence breaks, when he can't pull away anymore, is that his unconscious mind has registered that you're leaving the game entirely. This recognition is often the only thing powerful enough to shift his behavior, because it forces him to confront what he has been avoiding, his emotional attachment to you and his fear of losing it. The signs he loves you become evident once his unconscious defenses are broken down by your absence and your inner power. Emotional control in his behavior shifts from controlling you through distance to attempting to control his own terror of losing you through action. He'll text more frequently. He'll initiate plans. He'll be more vulnerable because his repressed emotions are now surfacing with intensity rather than being suppressed by your availability. The detachment work you've done on yourself, the genuine, deep work of knowing your own worth independent of his validation, is what makes this sustainable. Because here's the critical part that most people miss. If you reverse the dynamic but you're still secretly hoping he'll chase, if you're still secretly needing validation, he'll sense that desperation underneath the facade and you'll be right back where you started. The real power comes from genuinely letting go while simultaneously knowing your value. This is the inner power of a millionaire. They do desperately need the next deal because they know more deals will come. They operate from certainty rather than fear. The emotional psychology here is that once you've genuinely detached, once you've moved past the need for him to prove he loves you, an interesting inversion happens. He becomes obsessed with proving exactly that. The psychological principle of reactance, where people push back against perceived loss of freedom, kicks into high gear. His unconscious mind registers that he's losing something precious, and suddenly all his emotional control is directed toward winning you back, toward making you believe in his love, toward closing the emotional distance he created. Watch for this sign. His communication will become consistent. His actions will align with his words. His hidden feelings will no longer be hidden. And all of this happens not because you manipulated him or because you're playing games, but because you shifted his perception of the dynamic by changing your internal beliefs about your own worth. What we're really discussing here, at the deepest level, is a fundamental transformation in how you relate to love, to yourself, and to the power dynamics that govern attraction. The psychology of love reveals that sustained attraction is built on mutual respect and recognition of value, not on one person pursuing and the other receiving. When you've shifted your internal beliefs, when you've done the work to understand that your worth doesn't fluctuate based on his attention, you've accessed something that Carl Jung explains as individuation, the process of becoming your complete, integrated self rather than a fragmented version seeking wholeness through another person. This is where the real magic happens. You're no longer looking to him to complete you because you've completed yourself. You're no longer trying to decode his silence because his silence no longer threatens your sense of self. You're operating from a place of such genuine inner power that his behavior becomes almost irrelevant to your emotional stability. Let's be clear about what this means in practical terms. When he pulls away, you don't panic. When he goes silent, you don't ruminate. When he's emotionally distant, you don't chase. Instead, you stay grounded in the knowledge that his emotional attachment to you exists in his unconscious mind, whether he is expressing it or not. And whether he expresses it is entirely his choice and his responsibility. This is the millionaire mindset applied to love. You don't beg for the sale. You don't convince people of your value. You simply present it and let people make their decisions. The psychology of love teaches us that fighting his feelings, trying to convince him of your worth, or engaging in constant reassurance seeking actually undermines attraction. It signals weakness rather than strength. It signals desperation rather than self-possession. But when you embody genuine detachment, not cold indifference, but healthy emotional boundaries, you suddenly become someone worth pursuing. Your presence becomes a reward rather than an expectation. Your attention becomes something he has to earn rather than something freely given. Now, here's a concept that's often misunderstood but is absolutely critical: emotional control. This doesn't mean controlling him or manipulating him. This means controlling your own emotional reactions, your own narrative, your own behavior in response to his actions or inactions. When you have emotional control, you can be calm when he's chaotic. You can be certain when he's confused. You can be moving forward when he's stuck. This psychological stability is profoundly attractive because it suggests you have something he doesn't: inner resources, self-reliance, and peace that exists independent of his involvement. The unconscious mind recognizes this and registers it as high value. Someone who is whole doesn't need you to fill their voids. Someone who is at peace doesn't desperately need your reassurance. Someone who is secure doesn't require constant validation. And paradoxically, this is exactly the person that triggers the deepest emotional attachment because they represent challenge and growth rather than easy comfort. The signs he loves you multiply because real love is built on respect for the other person's wholeness, not dependency on their incompleteness. This is where repressed emotions become relevant again. Throughout his life, he's probably learned that expressing vulnerability, admitting need, or showing emotional dependence is weakness. His shadow contains all the tender, needy, vulnerable parts of himself that he's been trained to reject. So he pulls away. He maintains emotional distance. He fights his feelings because allowing them to surface would mean confronting his own shadow, his own vulnerability, his own need for connection. But here's what the psychology of love reveals. When you stop managing his emotions, when you stop soothing his anxiety through your pursuit, when you allow him to feel the full weight of potentially losing you, his shadow material becomes unavoidable. His repressed emotions start surfacing because they're no longer being suppressed by your attention and reassurance. What it really means when he suddenly becomes more emotionally present is that his defenses have crumbled and his genuine feelings are finally breaking through. The hidden feelings that he's been keeping locked away, often, even from himself, are suddenly demanding acknowledgement. The concept of falling in love, from a psychological perspective, is actually the process of dropping defenses and allowing someone into your inner world. Most people resist this because it feels dangerous. Your man might be resisting this because his unconscious programming tells him that vulnerability equals risk. But when you change the dynamic, when you make it clear through your behavior and your energy that you're a secure, stable, high-value person who isn't going anywhere just to fill your own void, something shifts in him. He realizes that it's safe to drop his defenses with you because you're not looking to exploit his vulnerability. You're not using his emotional attachment as a tool to control him. You're simply being secure in yourself, and that security is the permission he's been waiting for to be vulnerable in return. The emotional distance that seemed permanent suddenly becomes temporary because the conditions that necessitated it have changed. He no longer needs distance to protect himself from your neediness because your neediness has dissolved. Here's the ultimate revelation. When you've genuinely accessed your inner power, when you've truly internalized the belief that you are the prize, when you've moved beyond needing him to validate your existence, something remarkable happens. He becomes the one who's chasing. He becomes the one who's analyzing every word you say, replaying conversations, wondering if he's doing enough, terrified of losing you. The entire dynamic inverts not through manipulation but through genuine transformation of your internal state. Carl Jung explains that the external world is always a reflection of our internal world, and this principle holds true in relationships with stunning accuracy. When your internal world shifts from scarcity to abundance, from desperation to certainty, from neediness to wholeness, everyone in your external world, especially the person you're most involved with, has no choice but to respond to that new frequency. The psychology of love shows us that this isn't about the specific words you say or the specific actions you take. It's about who you've become, and when you've become someone who is complete unto themselves, who doesn't need external validation to feel worthy, who can walk away without bitterness because they know their value will be recognized elsewhere, that person becomes irresistible. The piece is understanding that this isn't a sprint, it's a foundation you're building for a lifetime. Letting go doesn't mean abandoning the relationship. It means releasing your grip on the outcome while maintaining your standards and your boundaries. Your detachment work is ongoing because maintaining your sense of self and your inner power requires continuous attention, just like physical health requires continuous exercise and nutrition. But once you experienced the shift, once you genuinely felt what it's like to be the one who pursued rather than the pursuer, you'll never be able to go back to chasing. You'll have experienced the truth that Carl Jung explains, that we become what we believe ourselves to be, and everyone around us reflects that belief back to us with perfect precision. The millionaire mindset isn't about money. It's about knowing your worth, operating from that knowledge, and refusing to diminish yourself for anyone's comfort. This is the real secret that transforms relationships completely and permanently. Now that you understand the psychological foundation, the mechanics of emotional attachment, and the transformation process itself, we need to address what comes after, because this is where most people fail. They experience the shift, feel the power, see the results, and then they sabotage themselves by reverting to old patterns. This is the critical juncture where your knowledge becomes either transformative or temporary. The psychology of love teaches us that sustainable change requires integration, not just intellectual understanding. You can't simply read about detachment and believe you've achieved it. You can't listen to concepts about inner power and suddenly embody them without doing the actual work of rewiring your nervous system, your beliefs, and your behavioral patterns. This is where Carl Jung explains the importance of shadow work, the ongoing process of integrating all the parts of yourself that you've been rejecting, denying, or suppressing. You must integrate not just the confident, powerful parts of yourself, but also the parts that feel scared, that doubt, that want reassurance. Only when all of these parts are acknowledged and honored can you achieve genuine wholeness. The integration process begins the moment you start noticing the changes in his behavior. He texts more consistently. He initiates plans. He becomes vulnerable in ways he never was before. His hidden feelings are no longer hidden. His repressed emotions are surfacing with intensity. And here's where the critical mistake happens. Many people, upon seeing these signs he loves you, immediately regress. They start overanalyzing his messages again. They start seeking reassurance again. They start broadcasting neediness again because they're triggered by the vulnerability they see in him. But understand this deeply. His vulnerability is not an invitation for you to return to managing his emotions. His emotional attachment to you doesn't mean you should revert to the dynamic where you're responsible for his feelings. This is where emotional control becomes essential, not controlling him, but controlling your own nervous system's response to his newfound emotional expression. The millionaire mindset understands this. Just because someone is pursuing doesn't mean you lower your standards or revert to desperation. In fact, it's the opposite. You maintain your boundaries even more firmly because you've proven to yourself that those boundaries are what create attraction. What it really means when he suddenly becomes more available, more communicative, more emotionally present is that he's finally registering you as high value. But this doesn't change the fundamental truth. His behavior is still his responsibility, not yours. The psychology of love reveals that the most stable relationships are built when both people maintain that individual sense of self while being in connection with another. You cannot slip back into believing that his happiness is your responsibility. You cannot return to analyzing his every word to determine how he's feeling. You cannot go back to checking your phone anxiously to see if he's reached out. These behaviors, if they resume, will immediately communicate to his unconscious mind that you're available to be chased down again, that you're still operating from a place of need rather than abundance. The entire dynamic will reverse, and you'll find yourself right back where you started, confused, chasing, trying to decode his silence, wondering if he really loves you or if he's just playing games. The concept of letting go takes on new meaning in this phase because now you're not just letting go of him or letting go of the outcome, you're letting go of the need to control how the relationship evolves. Carl Jung explains that life flows more smoothly when we stop forcing and start allowing. This doesn't mean passivity, it means active trust in the process. You've done the work, you've shifted your beliefs, you've embodied your inner power. Now you allow the relationship to unfold based on his choices and your boundaries, not based on your manipulation or his conditioning. This is where many people struggle because after months or years of chasing, the idea of simply allowing the relationship to exist without constant management feels terrifying. Your nervous system has been trained to believe that if you're not working, if you're not pursuing, if you're not convincing, then love will disappear. But this is exactly the belief that created the dysfunction in the first place. The millionaire mindset doesn't frantically work to maintain money once they have it. They maintain systems and boundaries that allow wealth to flow naturally. Here's a sophisticated understanding that will anchor you through this phase. Emotional attachment in the human brain is neurological, not just psychological. When he's been chasing while you're unavailable, his brain is literally flooding with dopamine, creating neural pathways that associate you with reward and excitement. When you're constantly available, constantly pursuing, his brain has no reward pathway being created because there's no scarcity, no chase, no uncertainty. By understanding this neurological reality, you can release guilt about stepping back. You're not being mean or cold, you're simply allowing his brain to wire you as a reward rather than an expectation. The signs he loves you become measurable in his behavior because his neural pathways have been rewired to seek you out, to think about you constantly, to plan how to keep you. This is the biology underlying the psychology of love, and it's far more powerful than any game or tactic you could employ. But there's a shadow side to this that we must address. What if after you've done all this work, he still pulls away? What if he doesn't respond the way you hoped? What if your emotional distance triggers his abandonment issues instead of his attachment response? The fighting his feelings dynamic doesn't always resolve the way we imagine it will. Sometimes people choose their fear over growth. Sometimes people choose comfort over challenge. And this is where the truly transformative work happens, because this is where you discover whether your power is genuinely internal or whether it's still dependent on his response. If you've only felt powerful when he started chasing again, then you haven't truly accessed your inner power. You've just experienced the validation of his pursuit. Real inner power is the power you maintain even if he never comes around. It's the certainty about your own worth that exists independent of whether he recognizes it. The millionaire mindset isn't dependent on making the sale. It's built on knowing your value regardless of who buys. The repressed emotions that surface during this phase aren't just his, they're yours too. You might find that as he becomes more available, you suddenly feel more vulnerable. You might notice that his emotional distance was actually protecting you from intimacy that you weren't ready for. You might discover that your chasing was actually a way of maintaining emotional distance while feeling like you were seeking connection. The unconscious mind is remarkably clever at protecting us from threats we're not consciously aware of. Carl Jung explains that understanding our own shadow material is the pathway to wholeness. And in relationship work, this means getting brutally honest about what you actually want and whether you're willing to receive it. Sometimes people sabotage their own success in relationships because deep down, they're not sure they're ready for the emotional intensity that comes with being truly loved and pursued. The integration involves establishing sustainable practices that anchor you in your new identity as someone who is whole, worthy, and irresistible. This might include daily practices that reinforce your inner power: meditation, journaling, physical exercise, time with people who value you, engagement in work or hobbies that give you purpose independent of your romantic relationship. These aren't band-aids. They're the foundation that prevents you from sliding back into old patterns when he's having a difficult day, when he's triggered, when he's temporarily cold or distant. The psychology of love shows us that attraction is maintained through ongoing demonstration of value. And your value is demonstrated not through words but through how you spend your time, who you spend it with, and how much you prioritize yourself. When he sees that your life is full, that your happiness isn't dependent on him, that you have options and opportunities, and a sense of purpose that exists independent of the relationship, something shifts in him permanently. He stops taking you for granted because he finally understands that you're not dependent on him, you're choosing him. This is the ultimate truth that closes the loop, when you genuinely believe you could walk away and be fine. When you've genuinely built a life that's fulfilling and complete without him. When you've genuinely accessed the inner power of someone who knows their worth, that's when he can't pull away anymore. Not because he's trapped, but because he finally recognizes what he almost lost. The detachment work isn't about emotional coldness, it's about emotional sovereignty. It's about knowing that your peace, your happiness, and your self-worth are non-negotiable and non-negotiable. And once you've embodied that truth completely and irreversibly, every single interaction in the relationship shifts. He treats you differently because you're treating yourself differently. He values you differently because you're valuing yourself differently. The entire dynamic, which once felt stuck and painful and hopeless, becomes fluid and natural and effortless because you've finally aligned your internal reality with your external circumstances. This is the millionaire mindset applied to love, and it's the most powerful transformation you can undergo. What we're entering now is the realm of advanced psychological mastery, the sophisticated understanding that allows you to not just experience the shift but to comprehend the deeper mechanisms at play and maintain the transformation indefinitely. Most people never reach this level because they become satisfied once the immediate results appear. They see him pursuing, they feel the validation, and they stop doing the internal work that created the shift in the first place. But true mastery requires understanding that the psychology of love operates on multiple levels simultaneously, and your ability to navigate all of these levels is what separates temporary success from permanent transformation. Carl Jung explains that consciousness itself is the goal of human development, and in relationships this means becoming fully conscious of the patterns, beliefs, and unconscious motivations that drive your behavior and his. When you achieve this level of consciousness, you're no longer at the mercy of reactive patterns. You're operating with intentional awareness of every dynamic at play. Let's examine what happens in the neurochemistry and psychology when emotional attachment is being rewired at this advanced level. His brain has been conditioned through years of his own relationships, his family dynamics, his childhood wounds, and his defensive strategies to believe certain things about love and intimacy. When you pull away, when you demonstrate inner power, when you establish boundaries, you're directly contradicting the neural pathways that have been formed over decades. This is why he might initially experience what feels like a panic response. His unconscious mind is screaming that something is wrong, that it's losing access to its drug of choice, your attention, your reassurance, your pursuit. The repressed emotions that surface during this period aren't just about you. They're about every person who's ever made him feel abandoned, every situation where he felt rejected, every moment where he felt his worth was being questioned. Understanding this with deep compassion while simultaneously refusing to take responsibility for healing his wounds is the millionaire mindset applied to emotional intelligence. You can understand his pain without absorbing it. You can recognize his hidden feelings without becoming responsible for processing them for him. The concept of the shadow becomes increasingly important at this level because now we're not just talking about his shadow or your shadow, we're talking about the shadow of the relationship itself. Every dynamic has an underbelly, the parts that are unspoken, the parts that are agreed upon tacitly but never explicitly discussed. In the old dynamic where you were chasing, the unspoken agreement was that he could control the pace and intensity of connection while you adjusted yourself to accommodate his needs. The shadow of that agreement was your resentment, your doubt, your fear that you weren't enough. His shadow was his fear of vulnerability, his resistance to intimacy, his need to maintain control through emotional distance. By changing the surface dynamic, you're simultaneously bringing the shadow material into consciousness. Watch for this sign. He might suddenly accuse you of being cold, of not caring anymore, of changing. What he's really responding to is the fact that his shadow material is being exposed. An exposed shadow is uncomfortable. Carl Jung explains that the unconscious doesn't like being brought to consciousness because consciousness requires responsibility and choice. When he was maintaining emotional distance, he could pretend it was about external circumstances. When you pull away, he can no longer hide from the choice he's making about how to relate to you. What it really means when he exhibits these resistance behaviors is that the transformation is actually working more deeply than you might have realized. The fighting his feelings that you're witnessing isn't him fighting his feelings for you, it's him fighting his own shadow, his own discomfort with vulnerability, his own terror of being truly known and still accepted. This is where many people make the critical error of stepping back in, of providing reassurance, of taking responsibility for soothing his discomfort. But doing so directly undermines the transformation because you're signaling that you'll return to your old role of managing his emotions. The psychology of love teaches us that sometimes the most loving thing we can do is to allow someone to sit with their own discomfort, to process their own emotions, to take responsibility for their own healing. Your detachment at this point isn't cruelty. It's actually the most honest and loving response possible because it respects his autonomy and his capacity to process his own inner world. Now let's discuss the concept of emotional control at this advanced level, because this is where it becomes genuinely sophisticated. Emotional control isn't about suppressing your emotions or becoming cold and distant. It's about having such a regulated nervous system that you can feel your emotions fully while still choosing your responses consciously. For example, you might feel hurt if he's been cold or dismissive. Emotional control means you acknowledge that hurt, you validate it, you process it internally, and then you continue moving forward with your standards and boundaries intact. You don't use his hurt as an excuse to lower your standards. You don't use his coldness as an excuse to pursue him. You don't use his silence as an invitation to reach out first. Instead, you maintain your position, you stay in your power, and you allow him the space to make his own choices about how he wants to participate in the relationship. The millionaire mindset in its most mature form understands that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is absolutely nothing. Sometimes the most commanding presence is quiet certainty. The psychology of love at this level also involves understanding what's called anxious avoidant dynamics. If he has an avoidant attachment style, which is extremely common in people who maintain emotional distance and pull away, his nervous system is literally wired to experience intimacy as suffocation. When you were chasing, you were triggering his avoidant response because your pursuit felt like an invasion of his space. But when you create distance, when you become unavailable, you're actually reducing the stimulus that triggers his avoidant response. However, here's the sophisticated part. He'll likely swing toward anxious attachment as he realizes he might actually lose you. He'll start pursuing because now the fear of abandonment is greater than the discomfort of intimacy. Watch for this sign. His communication becomes more frequent. His vulnerability increases. His hidden feelings become visible. What it really means is that you've successfully shifted his attachment nervous system response. Carl Jung explains that healing happens through conscious awareness and integration. And what you're witnessing is his integration of the parts of himself that fear abandonment and vulnerability. The repressed emotions that emerge in this phase are often deeper than the initial ones. As the surface layer of his defenses dissolves, you might see him become more emotional, more reactive, more irrational than before. This isn't a sign that the process is failing. It's a sign that it's working at a deeper level. He's accessing emotional states that he's been avoiding for years, possibly decades. His inner child, the part of him that experienced original wounds around love, acceptance, and belonging, is finally being triggered into awareness. If he has a history of abandonment, he might become clingy. If he has a history of suffocation or control, he might cycle between pursuing and pulling away. Understanding that these behaviors are manifestations of his unconscious wounding, not reflections of your actual value or worthiness, is crucial. The inner power that you've cultivated is what allows you to witness his process without being pulled into managing it. Here's an advanced concept that will genuinely transform how you navigate this: the idea that you're actually helping him heal by maintaining your boundaries. This isn't self-help pop psychology. This is legitimate emotional development. When you refuse to manage his emotions, when you refuse to provide constant reassurance, when you refuse to abandon yourself to take care of him, you're demonstrating to his unconscious mind that adults can maintain their own emotional stability while still being in relationship with another person. This is what secure attachment looks like, and it's often the first time he's experienced it from a romantic partner. By being the secure, stable, grounded presence in the relationship, you're literally showing him what emotional health looks like. His unconscious mind begins to reorganize around this model. He starts to believe that it's possible to be vulnerable without being destroyed. He starts to believe that intimacy doesn't require surrendering his autonomy. He starts to believe that falling in love doesn't mean losing himself. The psychology of love reveals that secure attachment is contagious. When you embody it consistently, others begin to move toward it as well. The piece of advanced mastery involves understanding that your transformation is actually complete regardless of his response. Whether he ultimately chooses to do his own work, whether he ultimately chooses to heal his wounds, whether he ultimately chooses to meet you in the middle, these are his choices to make. Your work is finished the moment you genuinely, deeply, authentically know your own worth, and you're willing to walk away if your worth isn't recognized and honored. The millionaire mindset doesn't bend the rules for any single customer. It doesn't lower its prices to make a sale. It doesn't compromise its standards because someone threatens to leave, and neither do you. Carl Jung explains that individuation, becoming your true self, is the ultimate goal of psychological development, and you achieve this not by winning someone's love but by winning your own. When you love yourself with the same intensity, devotion, and certainty that you were previously offering to him, everything changes. You become irresistible not because you're playing games or employing tactics, but because you've become someone worth being irresistible to. You've become whole. You've become sovereign. You've become the prize that everyone is competing to claim.
If you wish to master the psychology of love and decode his hidden feelings, I've placed a private guide in the first pinned comment to restore your inner power. Click the link below to finally understand what it really means when he retreats into silence. Take control of your self-worth and end the emotional distance between you today. If today's practice felt powerful, there is one specific psychological trap I detailed in my previous video that could still be neutralizing your signal. It explains exactly what happens in his unconscious when you stop chasing a perspective most people completely miss. Watch it next to ensure your self-worth remains unshakable while the results manifest.